I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast, a monthly roundtable podcast where the brothers behind Three Brothers Film discuss a chosen movie as well as broader topics in film culture. As always, we want to thank everyone who's been listening to our podcast since it debuted, and once again encourage you to join our conversation on film and film culture. Do please consider leaving a rating or review, or mention us to your friends and family. Reviews help new listeners find us and help us carve out a niche for real, substantive conversations about movies, as well as letting us know what you're enjoying or not about the show. I'm Anders Bergstrom, and today I'm here with my brothers,
Anta
and Aaron.
My last name is the same as my brother's.
And this week we're taking a trip back 20 years to the early years of the new millennium and talking about A Knight's Tale, the Heath Ledger star vehicle from writer-director Brian Helgeland. We'll talk about the film's cult status, how it holds up on rewatch, and what it tells us about how movies have changed in the last 2 decades. Also, as theaters begin reopening across North America, we'll use it as an opportunity to discuss what, if anything, the summer movie season means, and what, if any, films we're looking forward to.
Okay, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
William. If he believes it enough, a man can do anything.
We could do this. In 1 month, we could be on our way to glory and riches none of us ever dreamed of.
You can't even joust.
I think he's getting worse. He is getting worse. I won't spend the rest of my life as nothing.
You have to be of noble birth to compete.
So we lie.
The summer of 2001 was a unique time period. The early years of the new millennium, before the fateful events of September 11th later that fall would change society and movies in significant ways forever. The dominance of franchises had yet to completely eat up the blockbuster or popcorn film, though The Mummy Returns and Jurassic Park 3 showed an audience appetite for sequels in the traditional sense, before they were conceived of as franchises. Even superhero films weren't really on the radar. While X-Men, the previous year, had been a modest hit, it wasn't until 2002 that Spider-Man really kicked off the modern superhero dominance. What we do see in the 2001 summer movie season was plenty of variety of films in terms of genre and popularity, if uneven in quality. Some of the major films from that summer included DreamWorks' Shrek and Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor that May, while in June the first Fast and Furious film debuted, what is now a still ongoing franchise. Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge debuted at Cannes that spring, and Steven Spielberg's sci-fi epic AI was heralded with mixed reviews. Scary Movie 2 and Legally Blonde showed that comedies could still be hits. I don't want to belabor the point, but clearly the movie-going environment was quite different from today's. And so, A Knight's Tale arrived in the middle of May 2001, a minor hit featuring rising star Australian heartthrob Heath Ledger, who had gained an audience for his role in the loose Shakespeare adaptation 10 Things I Hate About You, and supporting roles in films such as Mel Gibson's The Patriot the previous year. A Knight's Tale has interest for this very reason alone, as Ledger would of course go on to greater acclaim in films like Brokeback Mountain and his all-time legendary performance as the Joker in The Dark Knight before his untimely death in January 2008. But A Knight's Tale is of interest beyond being an early Ledger star role. It is ostensibly a medieval adventure comedy, positioned as a break from the usual action focus of most medieval films. There are no large-scale action scenes or castle sieges. It's focused on an individual story, rather than on historical events or world-imperiling danger. It attempts to inject some anachronisms, like classic rock songs, in order to demonstrate a kind of emotional connection with the audience, rather than adhering to the kind of realism most historical films do. While A Knight's Tale may have seemed to be a new take on the genre of knights and castles, looking back after 20 years, it feels thoroughly a throwback. Mostly free of CGI, it's a traditionally filmed affair, with real sets and elaborate costume work. The central conflict is about whether Pauper William will succeed in his ruse impersonating a noble knight, win the tournament, and the hand of the Lady Jocelyn, played by Shannon Sossamon. While the inclusion of real historical figures, like Paul Bettany's Geoffrey Chaucer and James Purefoy as Edward the Black Prince, provides the film with some interesting historical portrayals, but certainly doesn't alter the history in a major way. I remember seeing the film twice in theaters, since it was an enjoyable enough film that I wanted to watch it with multiple groups of friends at the time. Of course, in those days, before home streaming and before being a middle-aged man with kids as I am now, I saw lots of films on repeat in theaters. Watching it for the first time in well over a decade and a half, I was curious if A Knight's Tale would hold up. Is it an unappreciated cult classic, or just a piece of early aughts nostalgia? And what does Knight's Tale tell us about how movies have changed in the last 20 years? So, to start off, what stood out most to you, Anton?
I think the thing that stood out the most to me on rewatch was how the anachronistic use of music actually kind of works, but it's more limited than I remembered it being. Like it's actually not all the music isn't a classic rock song. There's still a score that comes in at times, but at the very beginning when we're getting "We Will Rock You," the joust is setting up, and I think one of the best parts of the movie is that little moment where there's the guitar riff at the end of the song, and you see that the trumpets are playing, and as soon as they lift up their horns, the song ends, and it's as if the trumpets were playing that rock song.
Yeah.
And that to me on rewatch, I was like, oh, you know what? I actually think that works. It's interesting in a way, it's still interesting 20 years later. But I was like, oh, but this movie's actually not as anachronistic in other ways.
No, actually, there's only, I think, in the credits, at least 10 rock songs credited in the whole thing, which in today's sort of jukebox, Guardians of the Galaxy, world, seems pretty limited.
I think it's funny looking back at a movie like this, watching it again it's been well over a decade since I've seen it, and it's a movie that I watched a lot in the past, whether it was a popular film to watch in school. I think I did that multiple times, both in end of elementary and in high school. There's definitely a nostalgic enjoyment going back and revisiting a film like this, which, as you point out in your opening preamble, Anders, it's situated at that point before 9/11, before the superhero craze, before Lord of the Rings kind of changed what we think of as blockbusters that fall, before CGI took over. And a comment that, we've personally always or have made to each other or in some of our reviews, which is that movies that from the beginning of a decade often are more like the films of the past decade than the ones to come. So a film like Knight's Tale really has those 1990s hallmarks where it's crisp filmmaking, really, really conventional writing where it leans on the 3-act structure so hard, but as I've said in other things, is almost refreshing when you compare it to movies nowadays, which have no real structure at all. You have a star on the rise, you have this kind of fun, cheeky pop culture approach with the music. The fact that it's a medieval film and people were cued in with medieval films, whether it's Braveheart or other films of the time, whether it's First Knight, whether it's Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, that you're gearing up for a big battle, and this movie never does that. And so, despite the whole nostalgic thing and being oh, this is kind of a fun throwback, and the music I remember so much, and I remember it's oh, this is Heath Ledger as a Hollywood action star. The thing that kind of shocked me the most is Knight's Tale plays hugely as a sports movie.
Yes.
It is 100% just a high concept. You could imagine some coked out 90s writer guy being in Hollywood, okay, so we're going to take a medieval film, and we're going to take Rocky, and we're going to smash them together, and you're going to get the underdog, you're going to get the idea that, oh, he's going to become a knight, and so, it's the way that in reality and in our society, the way you can get better. Sports, man, you go from the streets and you go to the top, and it's it's just taking all those cliches and inspirational things that we attach onto sports and just doing it in the medieval film, and it works surprisingly well in that sense. And so now understanding genre a bit better and understanding how films are structured and what they're playing with in terms of the larger Hollywood history, it's just, I'm almost shocked that I didn't think of it that way before.
Yeah, and in fact, that's on if you go back and look at the Rotten Tomatoes page now, it's one of the critics things literally says, once you strip away the medieval trappings and things, this is basically a Rocky type movie.
I think it's I think you're definitely right that it's a sports movie. I mentioned that it is a historical film, and then the other thing it's operating in though is also right. It's a romantic comedy.
Yes,
and it's also a teen heartthrob focused around Heath Ledger, right? That's part of the genre too, and it's actually the mix of all those 3 genres that's going on, and that's maybe what actually makes this movie still interesting 20 years later, is that it's interesting that we get this this movie that's very invested in jousting as like a sport and how you would actually like what are the techniques you're going to use in that? How would you actually get success in it? And then on rewatch, I was like, wow, this is like, this is very much like a 90s sort of teen romance.
I think that's a really good point about it being the 90s teen romance and I think a lot of that comes out of, as you said, the casting of Ledger, who at that point would have been best known for, as I mentioned, 10 Things I Hate About You, and his role in The Patriot as Mel Gibson's son, right?
Yeah.
And so he was sort of like meant to be like the handsome young new Australian star, right? Which he's part of a long tradition of Australian heartthrobs, right? Today even we have like our Hemsworths and stuff.
And I rewatched this movie with my wife, who when she was young was very much into Heath Ledger, and she points out that this was the movie that really fixed him, in her mind. That like she had seen 10 Things I Hate About You, like that, like it was very much a Shakespeare teen comedy, but this was the movie that she was like, oh, like like she got really into Heath Ledger after this movie, and so like this was the earlier one sort of set it up, but this was the one that really like launched him as sort of like a heartthrob, I think.
I think the other interesting thing is that if we think about this as a romantic comedy in its structure and its movement toward reconciliation and the couple coming together in the end and things, which is kind of funny after 10 Things I Hate About You and the Shakespeare, and then we can talk about Chaucer in this, and it's interesting he jumps from Shakespeare to Chaucer in sort of a strange way. I want to connect it back to the use of music, because when it was advertised, and when I think, if I recall, its initial reception was that it was kind of postmodern, quote, right? Like the way people understood that term at the time.
Yeah, just like, the idea of having the music, like "We Will Rock You" with Knights, where people were like, "Whoa, like that's weird." Yeah, and I actually found that weird when I watched it.
But looking back at it now, I think. Partly because soundtracks are so, rock and pop soundtracks are so much part of the landscape, and it doesn't seem so maybe scandalous or genre bending. We can see how earnest this movie is. This movie is not a cynical, ironic, postmodern film. It plays with pastiche, where we've already talked about how it jams together so many different genres. But one of the things that struck me, was that this movie is like, it really believes, or at least wants to sell its like central story about like, can a man change his stars, right? Like,
how did the nobles become noble in the first place, huh? They took it at the tip of a sword. I'll do it with a lance.
A blunted lance?
Oh, no matter what, a man can change his stars. And I won't spend the rest of my life as nothing.
Like that, it really is like earnest in the way that like Rocky is earnest, or that like a film like that is earnest, right?
For sure, and that makes Rocky a great, a great antecedent to this film for its earnestness in its pursuit of this underdog rising up.
So I guess what I'm just to sum that up, it's like it seems like pastiche and postmodern pastiche, but it doesn't have the distance that we associate with that. And in fact, the music, I would argue, as you point out, actually serves to. I mean, one could imagine, in a sort of diegetic sense, that the filmmaker is putting those songs in because for their emotional affect that they have on the audience, which is, it's mostly music for like older or baby boomers and people who grew up in the 70s and stuff like that, right? And the emotional connections that they would have with being played at sporting events and bars and things like that, right? And as you say, like the trumpet cuts and the music ends, and obviously the trumpets aren't playing the guitar solo, right? So what I'm trying to say is that like it's just trying to give us the emotional attachment that the audience at the joust would have had. The audience at the joust would have heard maybe their trumpets and things like that, but they would have gotten pumped up for the event.
Yeah, and that's actually what makes the use of like a classic rock score in a medieval setting interesting, is that it's not just playing these songs for the audience now. It's playing those particular songs in order to get the audience now into the mindset and feelings of the characters then. So It plays "We Will Rock You" to be like, because a joust for people in the Middle Ages would have been like, you know, the excitement
football game.
Yeah, of a football game, of hockey, of seeing that sporting event. And same thing with the dance scene, and this becomes very, you know, explicit in the dance scene when it starts with the medieval dance music and the medieval dance movements, and then transitions into right, David Bowie golden years.
Yeah.
And the way it transitions, right, it's telling the audience they're not actually dancing to golden years. We're playing golden years so that you can understand what it would have felt like to be in a medieval dance. Because you can't, because if you're watching a medieval dance, you're going to be like, oh, that's lame, that's not sexy, there's nothing fun or exciting about that. But they want you to put you in that. And that's what actually makes it interesting.
It's exactly Baz Luhrmann's approach in his movies, and he specifically talked about it in Great Gatsby as using hip-hop as a means of getting the excitement and energy of a jazz party from the 20s, because jazz is considered old now, so he used music that we consider hot and cool. And so it totally is that, and the golden years transition in scene, the diegetic transition, tells us where the intents of the filmmakers lie and where the success lies, because I actually think that's probably the best scene in the movie on like a filmmaking level. The way that it completely sucks you in as it sucks the characters in. It shrinks the world to William and Jocelyn, and it creates this magic, right, in the dance, because it invests you in the fact that she comes to save him with showing the moves. Brings everybody else in, brings us into that moment between the two of them, and then says that, see, they're having this excitement and this spark between the two of them, but now we have to have a music cue that brings you into the spark. I mean, I love that song in general. It's one of my favorite Bowie songs, but I just think that even more than the We Will Rock You, even more than the Boys Are Back in Town, or the training montage to Lowrider, that is the scene where you can tell everything's working together, and there doesn't have that either ironic distance, which a lot of filmmakers use needle drops for, or the very winking jukebox modern thing, which is like, hey, I got good taste, don't you know?
Right, because it's obvious taste. It's not.
But the Lowrider selection, like that to me was an example of like, that could be any movie, whether you play Lowrider as a montage for like, you know, their training.
Around,
and
yeah.
that one wasn't, like, it's not necessarily getting us into the mindset the way that some of these other selections are.
That's just 90s filmmaking.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, no, but like in terms of 90s filmmaking and montage, it even has one of those montages where you keep getting the same shot and the characters reacting in different ways to the thing going on. What's the moment? I can't.
It's the moment when he keeps getting bashed because he's trying to lose for Jocelyn, and it's just the three, Esquire and the blacksmith, and they're all just like the shards of wood are flying over their head, and they're like, oh, this is getting boring now.
Yeah, and Alan Tudyk and Mark Addy and Laura Fraser. Yeah. But in terms of the other thing about 90s filmmaking, it's like I forgot how like bare bones movies sometimes were in the sets and stuff like that. But it felt tangible and real in a way, and I was really interested and invested in the stunts this time around. Like, they literally had people ride on horses and do jousting.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And I read a little bit about the making of this. So, like, the lances were made out of special, like, balsa wood. And they, like, filled them even sometimes with, like, spaghetti and things, so that when they crashed, they'd just, like, look like shattering, like, wood all over the place. And they trained, you know, stuntmen who were good on horses to do this. I'm like, that's awesome. Like, today it would totally be, like, let's say, Chris Hemsworth on, like, a CGI horse, and then, like, you know, it just wouldn't have the impact. Pardon the pun, but like,
and the cinematography for like the tilting, right, like the jousting, like, is actually really good, and the way that, you know, like, it's not a huge distance that they're charging, the use of camera angles, the editing, like, it actually creates pretty compelling action sequences. I found, like, you know, I was like, these are like, it's good, like, it's exciting to watch the jousting scenes.
But it's simple, right? Like, it's like,
yeah, and it's not overly flashy, right?
It's
like,
not trying to draw attention.
It's not a Zack Snyder action scene. There's like, it's not drawn out slow mo, but it's fairly straightforward. But it's like well done, and in the times it chooses to do a little bit more flashy of like, well, we'll put a camera that's sort of swinging alongside or something, is all very like well done, but it's also clear and straightforward.
Yeah, it's that it's classical Hollywood style from like the 90s. It's like, you know, the camera work is not trying to draw attention to the camera work.
And we should clarify, right? Like, I think it was Aaron's point, were saying, this movie embodies 90s filmmaking coming at the very beginning of the 2000s, right? Like as a final sort of gasp of that before 9/11 hits, changing the socio-political landscape, and then before things like The Lord of the Rings, that Christmas, the next year
Harry Potter,
Spider-Man throws everything up.
Yeah, Harry Potter too.
Harry Potter, that'd be November.
The other thing too, though, is that in the 90s, however much they had, sequels and trilogies, you had films like Independence Day, you had Jurassic Park, you had Men in Black. They did operate largely as that kind of last gasp of the star system in Hollywood. And so this movie really does set up as like a Heath Ledger star vehicle, where you can tell the filmmakers are like, we're going all in on this young, cute Australian guy, and he's going to be a big star. And, they were correct. Like, he did become a big star, and even in the short career, he still kind of looms large over the 2000s. But in some of this talk of, like, how not necessarily, like, loose the filmmaking is, but just there is a perfunctoriness to it as well that is, like,
yes.
I was laughing at points throughout the movie. Like, the first time Prince Edward the Black shows up, and I'm like, it's so obvious if you've read any like 3-act screenwriting book or like know anything about conventional Hollywood
when he
blockbuster
shows
structure.
up at the end?
No, when he shows up early on, where it's like
he'll be at the end.
where it's like
okay.
it's like it's totally a screenwriter being like, we have to write back. Okay, we have to have somebody make him a real knight at the end to give the payoff. So we have to write back. So we have to have royalty show up, and then who's a royal at the time? Okay, Edward. Edward was considered a great knight. He never became king. He died before he could be, but everybody would have thought that he would have been the great king. They don't know any history beyond the fact that he was the prince at that time, and so they're like, okay, we're going to insert him, and he, understanding that he's in disguise, so it's a parallel, it's a binary, so it hits the theme there, and then it sets up, so he's going to save him later, and we have to have the bad knight, our wonderful, wonderful man, Rufus Sewell, who I almost feel bad for him in this movie. Here's the thing. I love him in this movie because he plays such a beautiful, snide asshole. But I also feel bad because I swear this movie ruined his career. Because you had films before this where they would cast him as the protagonist. And after this movie, he would never be cast as the protagonist again.
Dark City.
Yeah, 2 years before that. 3 years.
But it's true. Like, it's ever since Rufus Sewell's just playing the jackass knight, who's snide, who's mean, who thinks he's better than everyone else.
Well, like, even the way he delivers some lines,
High Castle,
even
the
in the father.
Yeah, the way he delivers some of the lines is this: you're like, Hollywood really thinks that all you are is like the dark, seething British jerk in films, and it's a '90s Hollywood thing where he's got dark hair. Heath Ledger has light hair. He wears dark armor. Heath Ledger has nice shiny armor. And just the way that some of these 90s-isms work and conventional things work their way into the movie, like the thing that made me laugh so hard for how obvious it is too was at the end when he finally puts him on his back, and he's been saying he says multiple times, "You'll look up at me from the flat of your back." And Rufus Sewell's come back to him throughout the movie, right? You have been weighed, you have been measured, you have been found wanting.
Next time I face you, Count Adamar, you look up at me from the flat of your back.
Please. You have been weighed, you have been measured, and you have been found wanting.
And then at the end, they have all their heads pop in to be like, "You've been weighed." It's a classic 3-time. The callback has to be for the catharsis, the payoff. But the joke there is that none of the other characters are there to witness him say it the other 2 times. So I'm like, how do they know the lines to like do the comeback?
I think that sequence is actually because the way it plays, he's hit off the horse. You get a flash of white.
Yeah, and then them looking down at him.
Then they're looking down at him, but then it flashes back to him falling. That it might even be like in his mind.
Yes, absolutely.
Like it's not even necessarily
because they're all on
like
the side. They're still on the side watching it.
Yeah.
It's so as you said, the perfunctoriness, the kind of obviousness at times.
It's cornball.
I think at the time, a lot of people were unfair to it because, or maybe it wasn't unfair, but like at the time, you could be like, this is just cliched Hollywood filmmaking, right? Like in a lot of ways.
The movie's not really trying to be sophisticated.
No,
right?
it's not. It's meant to be a crowd pleaser. It's meant to be like accessible to everyone. But nowadays, everyone, even in like mainstream stuff, is trying to overthink everything so much that like it like becomes like convoluted, and like there's something about like, yes, it's obvious, but you know what? That's the whole point.
But it's obvious, but it's also like what Aaron's describing about, the redundancies built into the screenplay, the the repetitions to make sure everyone's super clear about what's going to happen, and nothing really happens in the movie that you're not expecting. But there's a certain clear, hard structure to the film that does seem lacking in a lot of current films that are like,
Absolutely.
like obviously that not every movie needs to have that hard structure, but when I go to see like a blockbuster or just sort of like an enjoyable action or romantic comedy, sometimes you want those anchors to just enjoy the film and the genre. And nowadays, I think you're right that like too many films are trying to do too much, or they're trying to be more like complex than they should strive to be. And this, looking back on this, you're like, it's nice that like its sort of simple clarity is actually refreshing. I found. I don't love everything about it, but
I'm less generous to modern filmmakers. I actually think I'm going to hit again a point that I think I said in the last episode when talking about some of the Oscar noms, which is filmmakers nowadays have no grasp of structure. None. And it's kind of similar to a person learning to write poetry.
Do you think it's
or something
choice or like
I think is that they've understood that you can. It's like the whole thing that people say about Picasso, right? Picasso had to learn to draw a brilliant lifelike painting before he could do cubism, but everybody after Picasso thinks that I can just draw cubism.
Yeah.
And it's like no, you have to understand what you're drawing before you can deconstruct it.
Yeah, and the best free verse is written by people who understand poetry and could write metered poetry.
And so however much I don't want every movie to be Knight's Tale. But the thing is that if you hew to this tried and true formula, because it is a formula, it really is. If you hew to it and you play it earnestly like this film does, if you have some interesting formal angles like the anachronisms, if you have a winning lead actor, if you have competent production design, and you just have a general entertainment quality to it, it does its job. The movie's never going to be anything more than like an enjoyable, somewhat interesting pastiche film of various genres and film styles, but like the movie is sure-footed and it's sound in its construction. So the whole thing is like when you're hearing to that formula, you have a solid foundation to build on. But if people try and circumvent that, I don't need that, the movie can be a disaster, and it often is.
I will say I think I was for a long time, at least in my mind, a bigger fan of this movie than you guys. But I think I share a lot of your praise for this at the moment. I'll give one criticism of it in which the film sort of foreshadows some of the negative directions that Hollywood filmmaking has gone in the time since. This movie's too long.
Yeah, definitely.
You should cut 20 to 30 minutes from this movie. If it was a 110-minute movie, it'd be much better than being, a 2-hour and 15-minute.
Most of the scenes have excess footage. Most of the scenes have shots that I'm like, you don't need that. Like, that could have been cut out.
They should have just cut the flashbacks.
Just like someone
entirely.
looking around, just they're like they add an extra shot of someone looking around to establish like what's going to happen.
But there's also some like things they add in there to try and hit the sports thing like really hard. Like there's that amusing scene when Chaucer and them go to the pub and they're like arguing with the French guys, and it's totally a British football hooligan scene where like they're even doing a song about William. Mm-hmm. Like they're like Ulrich von Liechtenstein, and like it's totally supposed to be like, the Brits in the audience are gonna love this because it's totally like football back then. But I'm like, the scene serves no purpose whatsoever.
But I guess I would say that like my view on the movie being too long is more that the scenes are a little bit bloated or have fat to trim rather than like I think you could cut out a scene like that, but like it's less that there's like scenes that I have no purpose.
No, that's fair.
Just, like,
but it's just funny how the movie will. You can tell that there's also the cynical screenwriter approach, like the Hollywood approach, where it's like you cut anything where if it's comprehensible, you cut out the thing. So there's never a scene where like the blacksmith agrees to come with them, because the second she helps them learn to dance, they're like, people are going to get clued in and understand she's part of the gang now. Just like there's never a scene that establishes why, like, Rufus Sewell's villain is following William. He just shows up there. Like, there's nothing setting up why he should suspect William is a fake, ever, in the film. And then he just does because it's like, well, that has to happen for the triumphant, real knighting to happen. So that's what I'm talking about with the perfunctory. I'm not actually, like, praising it across the board. It's cliched and it's corny. I think it works, ultimately. but I'm not going to say like it's a triumph of genre. It's just like the elements I like enough.
So I think we've talked, about the structure, the filmmaking. I think we all found it to be, enjoyable. But is it more than that? Is it more than just a competently made early 2000s, early Heath Ledger star vehicle? Or what would be the compelling reasons for someone to seek this out specifically today? What did you guys think? Is there anything?
Well, first of all, I'd say that I think, unfortunately, it's probably one of the best Heath Ledger star vehicles we have, looking back. With him dying, I'm not saying it's his best role, but if we want to sort of see one of his major early performances where he's the main character, and he draws in the audience, like this would be it. And so it holds a film history interest for that. I think for that alone, it'd be worth remembering.
Yeah, because most of his other major roles, I would say, that are worth remembering are more art house or aside from The Dark Knight, right? Like Brokeback Mountain, his role in Monsters Ball later this same year that he got acclaim for. I'm Not There, the Bob Dylan film.
He obviously has lots of other great performances and better performances, but one where he got to be the main character,
the Hollywood star,
and in a more conventional sort of film.
The other thing I found enjoyable, and I think people today might find enjoyable, is going back and seeing a lot of actors in small roles. We've mentioned Rufus Sewell is enjoyable, but even the supporting cast, for the most part, I quite like them. Seeing people that I hadn't seen in movies for a long time. I mean, I'm not sure what happened to Shannon Sossamon. Her career kind of. Well, I think I kind of know it was the Rules of Attraction, the adaptation of Bret Easton Ellis novel that kind of derailed her career. But for a while, she was kind of a up and coming actress. But the supporting cast, Alan Tudyk, always he's a pretty stalwart guy in that sense. Mark Addy, who would go on to play a little more famous medieval role in the first season of Game of Thrones as King Robert Baratheon, right? And even a couple of the other supporting actors, Berenice Bejo, who plays the handmaiden to Jocelyn, got acclaim later for the artist. If people remember The Artist at all, 10 years later, she could have a career there.
Does A Knight's Tale pop into my head more often than The Artist?
Probably does.
Yeah.
And then I was I couldn't figure out where I knew the blacksmith from, and I was and then I realized she plays Lydia on Breaking Bad.
Yep. No, I knew it when we were watching. I was like, where have I seen her? Oh yeah. But then, okay, you're forgetting, Anders. One of the other main reasons to see this movie is to see Paul Bettany play Geoffrey Chaucer, particularly naked Geoffrey Chaucer, which I do think is kind of a memorable thing in movies.
Oh yeah.
I actually think it's a great small role. And I think the idea of him playing, one of the major figures in English literature, and his first appearance is walking naked down the road, I think it's actually a great moment in movies. It's a great comic moment. And I think Paul Bettany's awesome.
Yeah, Bettany kind of is the one supporting role in this that kind of might even overshadow everybody.
Yeah. It's funny with Bettany and Ledger is that in some ways I look back at this movie and it's most notable beyond the anachronisms and beyond the kind of use of music. I think the thing that's most memorable is for promising something that never really came to fruition, specifically with Ledger as the new Mel Gibson, not in terms of a person, but in terms of as the Hollywood star, right? Ledger took an interesting career path. If he wanted to, I think this movie proved that he could have been a new Cruise or a new, Brad Pitt. He could have been one of those big Hollywood A-listers who has $150 million movie every year come out. And Paul Bettany in this shows of what a talent Paul Bettany is. And if you take this movie and you take Master and Commander, which are they're 2 years apart, and they're the two sides of Paul Bettany as an actor and how good he is. And it's kind of sad that he only has kind of had a later career resurgence in the Marvel properties as Vision. And to be fair, WandaVision gives him some actual stuff to do on the small screen. But I'm man, there's a guy who should have been something.
Bettany has. There's another good medieval film that's overlooked, The Reckoning. with Paul Bettany and
What
Willem
year is
Dafoe.
The
It came out
Reckoning?
the next year. I think it's in 2002.
Oh, it's that far ago?
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, no, because like this movie, like so Bettany's comedic side, which was really not developed later on. And then yeah, Master and Commander with Bettany, like just like an amazing, supporting major role, right? But you're like
Yeah.
he should have gone on to a lot more after I think those two films.
And remember, he's also in A Beautiful Mind the same year.
Yep.
Okay, yeah,
was-
so this would be
it was his
Beautiful
breakthrough
Mind
year,
winning.
yeah.
And he would have.
But like, I do remember
that's
even as a kid, I even remember as a kid thinking that Chaucer was like absolutely hilarious. And the thing that I think the screenwriters do a good job, or Helgeland, 'cause it's just him, does a good job of is mining that idea of like, ooh, it's Chaucer. And even though it has nothing really to do with Chaucer, the historical figure as we understand him, the fact that it is Chaucer gives an excitement, I think, especially for like somebody who knows just a bit about Chaucer, a bit about history.
Yeah.
And it connects to the title of the film.
And they connect to like a couple things. There's like
Well,
where
the
he's
partner,
like,
right?
Have you heard of Book of the Duchess? Anyone?
Yeah.
No, but there's also the scene with the guys that Chaucer loses his clothes to, the like religious dudes.
The partner in Simon the
And he's like, I'm going to make you infamous in literature for the rest of the time.
I think the other thing, sort of building on this, one other thing I find useful or interesting about this movie is there's not a lot of movies that portray the Middle Ages and focus on just like ordinary people in the Middle Ages. Usually we're focusing on knights in just like the military side essentially of the Middle Ages. And here's a movie where like, there's, the main character is aspiring to be a knight. It's jousting, so we still get like, they're wearing the knight's armor, they're doing all that. But at the beginning of the movie, there's one, like I was like, it's sort of interesting that there is something Chaucerian about its interest in sort of like regular people in the Middle Ages. And then two, early on with the humor is very strong, and there's a point where you're like, this movie could veer more into a Monty Python and the Holy Grail style like parody of the Middle Ages than it ever does.
Yeah.
But the sort of humor in the Middle Ages and ordinary people in the Middle Ages, they're actually not that common in movies. Like there's not a lot of Middle Ages movies, period. But like our Holy Grail is one of the best movies for both those things that actually is out there.
Yeah.
Kind of my last comment, it's jumping off of that, Anton, which is, I think Game of Thrones has kind of ruined all of our visions of the Middle Ages. And this movie has a touch of the romantic vision of the Middle Ages, not only through the romance, but also the idea of like the aspirational aspect of a knight, the courtship, the fact that the love between a knight and a lady would be like, the most romantic thing. Stuff like Game of Thrones just destroyed that in our popular imagination, where it's like, oh, a vision of the Middle Ages where women aren't beaten and raped and villages aren't burnt down and every knight isn't just like cutting guys' throats for fun. It's like,
Wouldn't
wow.
you say that I mean, Game of Thrones is definitely emblematic of that, but it goes back, I think, to the film Braveheart, speaking of Mel Gibson in Australia.
true.
Even though Braveheart includes both, right? But Hollywood didn't choose the romance of Braveheart. It chose the brutal, people being disemboweled and murdering people. And
It's just the Middle Ages became shorthand again over the last 20 years for they became the Dark Ages again. And this is the rare movie to be like, actually, we're not going to lean into that idea of the Middle Ages. We're just going to treat it as another story world that we can have actual, good guys and bad guys and all this fun.
I think that I know it's one more pitch for the film, which I literally haven't seen in 18, 19 years, but I think maybe I'll revisit The Reckoning this summer, because I do think that's another film that attempts to offer a portrayal of the Middle Ages that, while it's dark, is not... it's focused on regular people, and it's not saying it's like a unenlightened.
Yeah, and it's people, right? They're putting on plays, right?
Yeah.
Like in the Middle Ages, and so it's a completely different view of the Middle Ages than what we would often get. And I do think, I've said it already sort of once, but like there is something like Chaucer about its vision of the Middle Ages, not only for its interest in ordinary people, but also for its warmth, its humor, and then as well as its engagement in these deep conventions. And like it there's not a lot of movies out there like it, and I think that's something that has a lasting value. It's not the kind of movie that I'm going to put on a top 100 or even a top of that decade, but it's a movie that upon revisit I was like, I was glad to revisit it.
Yeah.
And there's aspects that definitely hold up.
So I'm glad we revisited it because I it was like thinking, it brought me back. It was a bit of a nostalgia trip to 2001 when movies, you kind of didn't know what you were going to get. Like there was lots of different genres, lots of different things. But today, it's 2021, and we're just starting make our way slowly out of a global pandemic. Movie theaters have reopened in many cities across the United States. In Ontario, they probably will reopen in June. Do summer movies even exist anymore?
Yes and no. Like,
what's on the? Is there anything on the docket for this year that seems like it'll come out / you have an interest in?
Well, to be honest, the reason I pitched us doing this episode was kind of drawing on the idea that like there's not that many new movies that interest me that much, and it is partially still like we're still pandemic fallout with Hollywood and theaters and everything. But last year there was no summer movie season, right? Like Tenet came out at Labor Day. The year before, I remember writing that Jurassic Park piece on the website, and specifically because I was like, this summer movie season is trash. There's nothing I'm interested in. So I'm just going to go watch old summer movies because at least it gives me the entertainment that I need. And so like I'm looking at I have a list here of some of the movies coming out this summer, and there's some horror movies that I'm sure would be fun. Like I'm sure The Conjuring 3 or The Forever Purge, I'll enjoy those. I like the previous ones. I'm curious about David Lowery's Green Knight movie just because I love going in the Green Knight.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting medieval adaptation potentially.
The Suicide Squad is probably the like big movie that I'm most intrigued by, but again, it's it's like a diegetic reboot of a bad superhero movie, and it's really just gonna be Guardians of the Galaxy DC version, but R-rated, right? Like
yeah.
So none of these things are new, right? I think that's the thing, Anders. You said just right off the top here. It's like back in the day, whether it was going into the movie store to rent something or going to the theater to see something, you didn't quite know what you were going to get. You might have seen a trailer, you might have seen a poster, you might know the actors in it, you might know the director, but you don't really know what you're going to get. And I feel like now everything is pre-digested, everything is quantified, everything's a piece of content, or a movie is responding to some specific online niche thing. So it's very, very hard to be surprised by anything that has the bandwidth of a Hollywood picture. Yeah. I feel like it has to be foreign or obscure for it to be surprising anymore.
And in 2001, you could seek out the film forums if you really wanted to, but with pre-social media, the saturation of initial responses wasn't there. So a movie actually had a bit of breathing room, even though it was still playing for opening weekends.
One comment, like we're recording this right now near the end of May. Fast and Furious 9 does not come out for 1 month, and I'm seeing reviews of it today. And I'm like, what is... Yeah. There is no movies in theaters, and yet the discourse remains 1 month prior. It just proves how, like, film criticism, filmmaking, the whole thing is so dysfunctional at this point.
Who's it for? Who's that review for?
It's for no one. It's for no one.
Like, I mean, it's interesting.
It's for Google
to
plug into the algorithm.
Yeah, I do think that's going to be probably one of the biggest movies of the summer that might get some people back to theaters. But like, it's kind of funny also that it's literally the 9th film in a series that started the same month that Knight's Tale came out.
It's true.
And what's also interesting about, A Knight's Tale coming out in May 2001, and we've already talked about some of the changes in that year, but the other thing I'm just thinking of is that 2001 is the beginning of the end of the summer movie season as being the dominant season. Because we get Harry Potter in November, we get The Lord of the Rings in December, and after that, Hollywood starts to say, you know what? We can make big bucks in other seasons than summer. And we can put out movies specifically just to to be blockbusters, to generate box office, that don't have to be just, best picture contenders or sort of horror movies or whatever we're dumping in other seasons. We can go for those big ones in other seasons. And in that's probably the trend of, the next 2 decades to now is the end of any distinct summer season as being the blockbuster season. Marvel continued, being like, we'll dump our biggest ones in the summer. But there's so many things, and we've talked about, like Zack Snyder in 300 making March a viable blockbuster time. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, like it reshapes the landscape in terms of when you're dumping things. And now, in the world of not many movie theaters, streaming all the time, the sense of like putting out movies based on a season is almost. I wonder if Hollywood even cares or is even thinking in the mindset of seasons anymore.
I feel like 2012 is like the last summer of note, where you had the Avengers and the Dark Knight Rises, because it was the peak of superhero in a sense, right? It was that it finally achieved the summit of the mountain, and it's been on that summit since.
Yeah, it has. We're not on the way down yet.
Or is that mountain
Plateaued.
cratered? It's cratered underneath.
Yeah. But the
walking on the clouds like Wile E. Coyote, just like running off the cliff.
Yeah.
Doesn't realize
We haven't realized yet.
Once the audience says, "Wait a second, look down, Wiley," then that'll be the end of it.
I think other people have said this on like a Twitter or forum, but like I'm really kind of curious as to what's the Marvel movie that's going to be a failure, like that finally when's it going to happen where
2050.
Aren't going to show up,
Well,
but talking to people, I was just like, okay, I was talking to neighbors and seeing things at the playground. People are still like watching through Marvel movies. And,
everybody I know watched Winter
they're
Soldier
can't
and
wait
Falcon.
But like I remember like the 90s. I mean, to go back to like something like Independence Day. Like do you remember the marketing
one of the great
for that
individual blockbusters
and the marketing for it
that
trailer, got
man.
the hype for starting at the Super Bowl and then like all through the fall. You were like, what is this? What is happening? And then that cut. You said the star vehicle. Will Smith with the
That's what I call a close encounter.
And at that point it was like, oh, he's in this movie? What?
Yeah, exactly. So, but like 2001 was kind of the last gasp of that, right? Where like there were some films that I really enjoyed that year that.
Well, I remember us being hyped for The Mummy Returns.
Yeah.
So we liked the first one a lot.
Hey, I've revisited The Mummy Returns, and I'll say that I still enjoy aspects of it quite a bit.
I watched
parts
The
of it
Mummy Returns a long time
are poor.
The Magi Army.
Exactly. Magi Army, Apocalypse.
Anubises. Endless
Egyptian
Anubises.
Apocalypse. I'm there for that.
But just going back, like I kind of talked about some of these films in the beginning, but like that you had like some really like different films after Mummy Returns opened up that May. Knight's Tale, Shrek was a huge hit.
Yeah.
Pearl Harbor, Moulin Rouge, Swordfish, Lara Croft Tomb Raider was the beginning of sort of video game adaptations and things. Fast and Furious. AI was a summer release for Spielberg. It was just a different time.
And then it becomes the franchise era, right? Like after.
Yep.
And even the franchise movies like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, which I think are kind of the gold standard, it's still set into a new phase that, it's kind of like you could take Harry.
New there.
No, but you could take Harry Potter and you could take Lord of the Rings and you kind of put them as the Star Wars and Jaws of the new millennium, and how like they're the great gold standard, but the movies that came after and try to copy them kind of ruined the industry in a respect.
Yeah.
Or it ruined aspects of it. And I just think, Anders, you made the comment like, is there going to be a Marvel movie that people don't like? And, I don't know really anybody who's talking about Shang-Chi as being a movie they're excited about, aside from like the kind of perfunctory performative stuff online.
But people will watch it, though.
Even if it bombed in North America, it could be a huge hit in China and Marvel wouldn't care, right? Like it's the kind of thing where the idea, the thing that makes me so a little bit depressed when talking about some of this stuff is not only my affection for big blockbuster kind of popular movies in general, but it's the fact that the idea of making a movie for an audience or caring what the actual audience that goes to see the movie thinks about it is like beside the point. It's all, that decimal point has already been rounded onto the spreadsheet to get some investors next fall for some streaming service, or it's calculated to such a degree that like if we just put this on 300,000 screens in China, like, I'm exaggerating this stuff, but it's I feel like as the world shrinks to where it's just Disney and Universal, like Amazon, and then like you get like Universal, Paramount, like little bits of the old studios there.
Yeah.
And it's just whatever's going to go on HBO Max or the other. I'm not feeling optimistic about it. And even though there are movies this year that I'm super excited about, and they're big movies, like the new James Bond movie and Dune. And to be honest, Dune is the movie that most people I know who don't even like really follow movies very closely are talking about as the movie they're excited about. You know, maybe we will get some movies kind of like The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter again, where we're like, oh, this is what the blockbuster can do. This is great. But it's not the summer movie. It's not that kind of, you know, it's weekend of May 23rd to 25th. It's the Star Wars weekend. I'm going to go to the theaters and see whatever the big movie is, knowing that maybe I haven't seen the trailer, maybe I haven't seen the poster, maybe I don't even know anything about it. But the idea that it's a big movie opening on that weekend promised me some kind of entertainment. And
you would build the counter programming around that too, right? Like, so other films could like borrow a racing metaphor, Fast and Furious. Like you could drift in behind, right? So like you would do the like romantic comedy counter programming. Like About a Boy came out the same weekend as Attack of the Clones, right? To like pick up some of that. Like, but it's a very different market. It's a very different audience, obviously.
Yeah.
The world has really changed. I think that's one of the things. It's like we tend to think of like the 2000s as being relatively stable, that things haven't changed, but the world has radically changed in 20 years. And obviously the last 15 months have accelerated our view of what has changed. But I think a lot of these changes can't be just pinned on the pandemic. Hollywood was starting to shift. I think, as you said, 2012, mid-2000s might be like the kind of things had fundamentally changed at that point. And it is depressing. I don't want to necessarily end this on like a sour note of like, well, I'm just, but on the bright side, we can go back and watch The Knight's Tale.
I think we're wrestling like the three of us over a number of podcasts now have been kind of wrestling with the question of like, how do we sort of approach movies as just regular film goers and also as critics, but how do we approach movies within this new framework of a streaming primary world? And so let's say movie theaters come back strong in North America. They're still, I don't think, are going to be like the primary form. And what you've just mentioned, Aaron, about some of the the approaches in terms of investment, just as the corporatization of Hollywood altered how their approach to filmmaking, now the streaming and sort of those sort of investment plans shapes also how they're going to start making the movies. And I feel like part of the thing about the summer blockbuster was just that like it's a known thing, and you go into the summer being like what are those blockbuster movies? And part of what I'm having a difficult time with for film viewing is just like what do I have? What's my framework for guiding my viewing on some sense? Because I don't have this seasonal anymore where it's like, okay, it's summer. These are going to be like the big sort of like mainstream audience blockbuster type vehicles. And then we're going to get a bunch of dramas dumped out in the fall. And then we're going to get some Oscar runners. Now it's streaming. Everything is based on the algorithm, based on, what I've been viewing. And so it can be hard to sort of be like, okay, like what guides my viewing at all?
So hopefully you've enjoyed our conversation here about the state of summer movies, and maybe we've, A Knight's Tale is something that you want to revisit. But if not, hopefully we got you thinking about, what summer movies mean and what they might be. But, let us know, what summer movie are you looking forward to? Have we got it wrong? Is there something that you're like really excited to see and that might get you back into theaters after the pandemic? Let us know. And until next time, thanks for listening.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.